A judge faces a defendant in court who brings back memories from the past. Flawless evidence sparks suspicions of a conspiracy. A connection from the past threatens to come to light during the trial. The courtroom becomes a stage for secrets, threats, and suspense. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know which city you're watching from. New York City, 1975. The Manhattan Supreme Court was buzzing with the typical Monday morning bustle, but there was something different in the air. Groups of journalists clustered in the marble corridors, their cameras and recorders ready to capture every moment of what promised to be the most important trial of the decade. Judge Sarah Thompson observed the commotion through the window of her chambers, her fingers drumming nervously on the mahogany desk. At 45, Sarah had built an unshakable reputation in the New York judiciary. Known for her firm stance and balanced decisions, she was respected by both her peers and the press. Her brown hair, always tied in a discreet bun, and gold-rimmed glasses composed the austere figure everyone expected from a judge of her importance. "Judge Thompson, the files for the Anderson case have just arrived," announced her clerk, Jessica, placing a considerable stack of documents on the desk. Sarah felt her stomach churn as she read the name on the case file. Michael Anderson. 20 years had passed, but that name still had the power to transport her back to the corridors of Columbia Law School. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to leaf through the case file. The charges against Michael were serious: embezzlement of millions in public contracts, bribes, bid rigging. The same Michael who, during law school, spent nights debating ethics and social justice at the iconic Tom's restaurant. The idealist who had created one of the largest philanthropic foundations in the country was now being accused of corruption. "Are you all right, Your Honor?" asked Jessica, noticing the pallor on the judge's face. Sarah adjusted her glasses, quickly composing herself. "Yes, just analyzing the complexity of the case," she replied, her voice not betraying the inner storm consuming her. That afternoon, during the meeting with her team, Sarah maintained her professional composure as they discussed the trial procedures. But her mind wandered back to 1955, when she and Michael were inseparable. She remembered the heated discussions in the student center, the shared dreams of transforming the country through justice and law. "The defendant has powerful connections," commented one of the assistants, bringing Sarah back to the present. "The press is calling this the trial of the century." The judge merely nodded, aware of the weight of responsibility she carried. On her desk, an old photograph of the graduation class remained hidden in the bottom drawer, a secret that now threatened her present. At night in her apartment on the Upper East Side, Sarah faced her ethical dilemma. Recusing herself would be the proper protocol, but that would mean explaining the reason. How could she justify her withdrawal without revealing her old friendship with the defendant? And if this revelation tarnished not only her reputation, but also the legitimacy of all her previous decisions? The phone rang, startling her. It was her father, retired Justice William Thompson. "Sweetie, I saw in the papers that you'll be presiding over the Anderson case." His voice conveyed concern. "It's going to be a difficult trial." Sarah gripped the phone tighter, wishing she could share her conflict with her father, but knowing that not even he could know the truth. "I'll handle it like any other case, Dad," she replied, trying to sound convincing. After hanging up, Sarah walked to her study, where she kept her college diaries. In one of them, she found a yellowed photo. Her and Michael on the law school steps, young and carefree smiles. On the back, a handwritten message: "To Sarah, my legal conscience. May our ideals never be lost to time. Michael, 1955. The following morning arrived with the weight of an irrevocable decision. Sarah chose to remain on the case, convinced she could separate her past from her present duty. She donned her robe with habitual care, each movement a ritual that reinforced her commitment to justice. As she entered the packed courtroom, Sarah maintained her neutral expression, even when her eyes met Michael's for the first time in 2 decades. He looked different, graying hair, worry lines marking his face, but his gaze still carried that familiar intensity. For the briefest moment, their professional masks faltered, a mutual recognition that only they perceived. "I call this session to order," announced Sarah, her firm voice echoing through the room. The ritual words of law had never seemed so heavy. As the initial procedures began, she knew she was embarking on the most challenging journey of her career, a test not only of her legal capacity, but of her very integrity. The first week of the trial unfolded like a carefully orchestrated play. The public prosecutor, Thomas Reed, presented his accusations with surgical precision, unraveling a seemingly irrefutable web of evidence against Michael Anderson. Sarah observed every movement from the bench, her face a mask of impartiality that concealed the inner turmoil. "The documents prove, Your Honor, systematic transfers to offshore accounts," argued Reed, his resonant voice filling the courtroom. The defendant built a facade of philanthropy to mask a sophisticated embezzlement scheme. Sarah noticed how Michael, seated among his lawyers, remained impassive, only his fingers drumming lightly on the table betraying his unease. During a recess, Sarah took refuge in her chambers, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. She remembered a specific afternoon in 1955 when she and Michael had participated in a pro bono legal assistance project in the Bronx. His passion for social justice was genuine. How could that same man have transformed into the corrupt figure the district attorney's office described? Her reflections were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was David Miller, an investigative journalist from the New York Chronicle, known for his incisive reports on corruption. "Judge Thompson, could you spare me a few minutes?" he asked with a smile that didn't reach his keen eyes. The interview began with routine questions about the progress of the trial, but soon took a disquieting turn. "It's interesting how fate presents us with twists, don't you think?" commented David, casually leafing through his notebook. "For instance, I found some old photographs from Columbia Law School. You graduated from there, didn't you?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but years of courtroom experience helped her maintain her composure. "Yes, like many other judges," she replied dryly. "But I don't see the relevance of that to the case at hand." That night in her apartment, Sarah rummaged through old boxes of memorabilia. She found a yellowed invitation to a graduation party where she and Michael had danced until dawn. The next morning, he had left for an exchange program in California, promising to keep in touch. The letters became less frequent over time until they stopped completely. The phone rang, interrupting her reminiscence. "Sarah?" The familiar voice of her sister Rachel sounded worried. "I just saw Michael being interviewed on the evening news. Are you okay?" Sarah sighed, grateful for her sister's concern, the only person who knew the whole story. "I need to stay focused, Rach," she replied, massaging her temples. "The truth needs to prevail, regardless of the past." But which truth? With each new session, the evidence seemed to pile up against Michael, even though something about the presented evidence bothered her legal instinct. The next morning, during the testimony of a key prosecution witness, Sarah noticed something strange. The witness, a former employee of Michael's company, seemed too nervous, his answers sounding rehearsed. When he mentioned a specific meeting in 1974, Sarah noticed an inconsistency in the dates that no one else seemed to catch. During the lunch break, she received a mysterious envelope in her chambers. Inside was only a newspaper clipping from 20 years ago, showing Michael inaugurating his first school for underprivileged children. On the back, a typed message: "Not everything is as it seems, Your Honor. Some truths are too inconvenient to come to light." The afternoon brought new testimonies, but Sarah was distant, her mind working on the inconsistencies she was beginning to notice. The way the evidence fit together perfectly, almost artificially, the testimonies that seemed to follow an invisible script, and especially the silent pressure that hung over the courtroom, as if invisible forces were manipulating the strings of this legal theater. At the end of that session, when everyone had left, Sarah remained in the empty courtroom. Her eyes found the chair where Michael had sat all day. For a moment, she saw again the young idealist she had known, superimposed on the image of the accused businessman. A doubt began to form in her mind. What if this entire process was more than it appeared? The sound of footsteps in the corridor brought her back to reality. It was time to go home, but Sarah knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. That night would be dedicated to meticulously reviewing every document in the case, every testimony, every piece of evidence, because now, more than ever, she needed to be sure that the justice she had so long defended was not being used as an instrument of elaborate revenge. The third day of the trial began with a surprise. The main prosecution witness, accountant Frank Miller, did not appear at the hearing. Prosecutor Reed, visibly frustrated, informed the court that Miller had suddenly traveled abroad for urgent personal reasons. Sarah noticed a peculiar gleam in Michael's eyes upon hearing the news. "Your Honor, I request an adjournment of the hearing," Reed petitioned, his usual confidence slightly shaken. Michael's attorney, George Fields, a white-haired gentleman with a shrewd expression, immediately protested. "The convenient absence of the witness cannot prejudice my client, who has already been facing unfounded accusations for months." During the argument between the lawyers, Sarah discreetly leafed through her personal notes on the case. The night before, she had discovered that 3 other important witnesses had also become mysteriously unavailable in the weeks leading up to the trial. A pattern was beginning to form. During the lunch break, her clerk Jessica rushed into her chambers. "Judge Thompson, there's a man insisting on speaking with you. Says he has information about the Anderson case." It was Robert Taylor, a former employee of the finance department of Michael's company. His countenance bore the weight of someone guarding a secret too heavy to bear. "Your Honor, I don't have much time," said Taylor, nervously glancing around. "There are powerful people interested in this case. Mr. Anderson, he discovered something he shouldn't have, something big involving inflated contracts in the Treasury Department." Before he could continue, a court officer interrupted the conversation, announcing the resumption of the session. In the afternoon, during the testimony of a Federal Reserve director, Sarah noticed Michael discreetly passing a note to his lawyer. Their eyes met for an instant, and she recognized in them the same determined gleam from their college days when he refused to accept injustices. After the session, back in her chambers, Sarah received an anonymous call. "Dig too deep into this case, Your Honor, and your career won't be the only thing at risk," said a distorted voice before hanging up. She remained motionless, the phone still in her hand, remembering her father's words about the behind-the-scenes of the judicial system. That night, breaking all protocols, Sarah decided to visit the law school library. In the old archives, she found something intriguing: a series of 1974 news reports about a corruption investigation that had been mysteriously shelved. Michael's name appeared in a footnote as a technical consultant on the case. In her apartment, Sarah was spreading documents across her living room table when her sister Rachel arrived unannounced. "I saw journalist David Miller following you today," she said, concerned. "He was photographing you as you left the courthouse." Sarah felt her stomach sink. If they discovered her connection to Michael now, everything would be lost. "Rach, something's wrong with this case," Sarah confided, showing her sister her notes. "The evidence is too perfect. Witnesses are disappearing, and now these threats." Rachel examined the documents carefully. As an investigative journalist herself, she knew well the signs of a fabricated story. "Remember when Michael defended that project for transparency and public bidding?" Rachel asked. "It was right before he started his company. He was always against the bribery system." Sarah nodded, recalling the ideals they had shared. How had she not noticed before the contradiction between the Michael she had known and the accusations against him? A distant thunder announced the arrival of rain when Sarah found, among the papers, an old photo of the Constitutional Law Study Group. In it, besides her and Michael, was a familiar face, the current Secretary of the Treasury, Edward Barnes, the same one who, according to the court records, had approved the questioned contracts. The rain began to fall heavily as Sarah organized her discoveries. Each new connection she established pointed to a larger conspiracy than she had imagined. The case wasn't just about Michael. It was about an entire system of power and corruption that someone wanted to keep in the shadows. Before going to bed, Sarah received another mysterious envelope. Inside was only a newspaper clipping with a circular headline: "Investigation into inflated pricing in public works, shelved due to lack of evidence, 1974. In the margin, a handwritten note: "Follow the money, but be careful what you'll find." The tension at the Manhattan Supreme Court increased with each day. The next morning, the corridors buzzed with rumors about the disappearance of yet another witness. Sarah observed the movement through the blinds of her chambers when George Fields requested a private audience. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, after carefully closing the door, "I have reason to believe that my own office is being monitored." His tired eyes revealed sleepless nights. "Yesterday I found my office ransacked, though nothing appears to have been taken." Sarah felt a familiar chill. The same type of intrusion had happened in her apartment days before. During that morning's session, Prosecutor Reed presented new bank documents. "These statements prove systematic transfers to shell companies," he declared, his voice echoing through the room. Sarah, however, noticed something peculiar about the dates. All the transactions happened exactly when Michael was abroad, on documented and public trips. During the lunch break, Sarah received an unexpected visit. Emma Anderson, Michael's wife, was waiting in her chambers. "Judge Thompson," she said with contained dignity, "I know we shouldn't be talking, but I need you to understand something. Michael discovered irregularities in the Treasury contracts before he was accused. He was preparing a dossier." Emma's revelation confirmed Sarah's suspicions. During the afternoon, while listening to the testimony of a forensic accountant, her mind worked connecting the pieces. The alleged corruption scheme attributed to Michael had begun exactly after he took over the auditing of important government contracts. In her chambers, after hours, Sarah received an even more surprising visit. Journalist David Miller returned, but his tone was different. "Your Honor, I've been investigating on my own," he said, lowering his voice. "I found connections between the companies accusing Mr. Anderson and 3 cabinet members. You're in danger." That night at home, Sarah received a call from her father. "Sweetheart, I just found out they're preparing a complaint against you with the Judicial Conduct Commission," he warned. "Someone is spreading rumors about your impartiality in the case." Sarah felt the weight of the words. Her worst concern was materializing. While reviewing old cases, Sarah found a crucial connection. In 1974, Michael had participated in an audit commission investigating inflated pricing in public works. The commission was abruptly dissolved, and months later, the accusations against him began. The phone rang again. It was Rachel, her sister. "Sarah, I need to see you urgently," her voice conveyed concern. At the cafe near the courthouse, Rachel showed Sarah a folder with newspaper clippings. "Remember the bidding scandal of '73? 3 journalists investigating the case suffered mysterious accidents. One of them was my colleague. Back at the courthouse, Sarah realized she was being watched more closely. Employees whispered in the corridors, and even her chamber officer seemed different. During an oral argument, she noticed an unknown man taking detailed notes about her every move. That night, working late in her chambers, Sarah received a manila envelope with no return address. Inside, she found old photographs. Her and Michael at graduation, at social events, at student center meetings. Along with them, a typewritten note. "How long until everyone knows? Do the right thing." The pressure was mounting, but Sarah was beginning to understand the bigger game she was involved in. It wasn't just about Michael or about her. It was about an entire system that felt threatened. The too perfect evidence, the disappearing witnesses, the veiled threats. Everything was part of a larger mechanism. On her desk, a new stack of motions awaited analysis. On top, an urgent request from the prosecution for a breach of bank secrecy for all of Michael's companies. Sarah examined the document with renewed attention. Each procedural move now seemed part of a larger strategy, a chess game, where she needed to anticipate not just the next move, but the entire match. Rain began to fall again over New York City, and Sarah remained in her chambers, now transformed into a trench in a silent battle. On the wall, the clock struck almost midnight when she began to draft an order that would change the course of the trial. Her decision was made. It was time to ask the right questions, even if the answers were too dangerous. Sarah's decision had the effect of a bombshell in the legal community. Instead of authorizing the breach of confidentiality for Michael's companies, she ordered an independent audit of all government contracts related to the case, including those of competing companies. Prosecutor Reed vehemently protested, arguing that the measure went beyond the scope of the trial. "Your Honor is clearly losing focus of the action," argued Reed, his face red with indignation. Sarah remained impassive in her seat. "Mr. Reed, to judge fairly, I need to have a complete view of the context in which these alleged irregularities occurred," she replied, her firm voice echoing through the room. Leaving the courthouse, Sarah found her car with flat tires. While waiting for assistance, she received a call on her private cell phone, a number only family and close friends possessed. "It's amazing how accidents happen when we meddle where we shouldn't," said an unknown male voice before hanging up. In her apartment, Sarah was receiving a visit from Rachel, who brought new discoveries. "Look at this," her sister said, spreading documents across the kitchen table. 3 months before the accusations against Michael, he participated in a closed meeting at the Treasury Department. The next day, his company lost 5 important contracts to competitors. As they examined the documents, the phone rang again. It was George Fields, his voice trembling. "Judge Thompson, they broke into my office. They took all the documents from the Anderson case, but they left something for you." Hours later, an envelope arrived in her hands. Inside, an old photo of the law school graduation committee, with familiar faces marked with a red X. The next morning, the city's largest circulation newspaper carried an article insinuating possible bias in the trial. The article, signed by a columnist known for his attacks on the judiciary, questioned the sudden change of direction in the process. Sarah recognized the strategy. The campaign to discredit her was beginning. During that day's session, a new character appeared in the courtroom. James Blackwell, a businessman known for his government ties, was watching the trial from the gallery. His eyes never left Sarah, who remembered seeing him in old photographs with cabinet members. During the break, her clerk, Jessica, rushed into her chambers. "Your Honor, Mr. Robert Taylor, that witness who spoke with you, he's been in an accident. He's hospitalized." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Taylor was the only witness who could confirm the existence of the dossier mentioned by Emma. At night, alone in her chambers, Sarah received an unexpected visit. Michael had requested a private audience through his lawyers. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time since the beginning of the trial, "they have my family under surveillance. Emma and the kids had to leave the country yesterday." The meeting, strictly professional and monitored, lasted only 15 minutes, but it was enough for Sarah to confirm her suspicions. In Michael's eyes, she saw not the look of a corrupt man, but of someone who had discovered something too big and was now paying the price. Back in her apartment, Sarah found signs that someone had been there. Nothing had been taken, but her drawers were slightly disorganized and her files minimally out of order. On the living room table, a newspaper was open to the obituaries page with a message underlined, "The truth sometimes comes at too high a price." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She mentally reviewed every piece of evidence, every connection, every veiled threat. The case had transformed into something much bigger than a simple corruption trial. It was a fight against a system that fed on silence and fear. Close to midnight, she received a call from her father. "Honey, I just found out they're preparing a story about your past in law school. They know everything." Sarah thanked him for the warning, but her decision was already made. If they wanted war, they would have war. She hadn't dedicated her life to justice to bow down to threats. With the first light of morning, Sarah began to draft a decision that she knew would change not only the course of the trial, but also her own life. It was time to bring the shadows to light, no matter the personal cost. Sarah's decision fell like lightning in the courtroom that morning. She ordered the immediate summons of 3 cabinet members and 2 CEOs of major construction companies to testify as court witnesses. The boldness of the measure caused instant uproar. Journalists ran through the courthouse corridors, phones rang incessantly, and aides exchanged nervous glances. "This is a legal absurdity," vociferated Prosecutor Reed, gesticulating emphatically. "Your Honor is turning an objective criminal trial into a political witch hunt." Sarah maintained her serene posture, adjusting her glasses with a characteristic gesture. "Mr. Reed, the right to a full defense includes the complete contextualization of the facts. I stand by my decision." During the lunch break, her chambers received 3 calls from the Court of Appeals. Sarah knew the pressure was just beginning. On her desk, a new stack of documents caught her attention. They were old news reports about similar cases that had been mysteriously shelved in the last 5 years. Rachel appeared without warning, bringing a brown folder. "Sarah, I discovered something," she whispered, closing the door. "That meeting at the Treasury Department in '74. I found the complete list of participants. And guess what? James Blackwell was there, along with 2 of the cabinet members you summoned today." The late afternoon brought unusual movement. David Miller, the investigative journalist, requested an urgent interview. "Your Honor," he said with a different gleam in his eye, "I have documents that prove the existence of a much larger scheme. But I need guarantees. We've already lost 3 colleagues investigating this story." At home, Sarah was receiving increasingly frequent phone calls from fellow judges, some offering veiled support, others suggesting caution. "You're messing with very powerful people," warned an old college colleague. "They won't let you get to the end of this." The night had barely begun when her doorbell rang. It was Emma Anderson, who had secretly returned to the country. "I need to give you something," she said, nervous. From her purse, she pulled out a flash drive. Michael kept backup copies in several places. "This proves everything: the fraudulent contracts, the threats, the real culprits." As she examined the files on her laptop, Sarah realized the real dimension of the conspiracy. It wasn't just about inflated contracts. It was about an entire system of power that sustained itself through threats and silence. Michael had discovered only the tip of the iceberg. The phone rang again. It was George Fields, his voice conveying urgency. "Your Honor, I just received an anonymous document. They're planning a news story for tomorrow, exposing your relationship with Michael in law school. They want to disqualify the entire trial." Sarah took a deep breath, observing the illuminated city through her window. 20 years of career, a reputation built with dedication and ethics. Everything was at stake. But the truth emerging from the documents was bigger than her own career. Near midnight, she began to draft a document that would change everything. A decision where she would expose not only her past with Michael, but also all the evidence she had collected about the larger conspiracy. It was time to put all the cards on the table. The next morning, before leaving for the courthouse, she received one last anonymous call. "There's still time to back down, Your Honor. Think about your career, your family." Sarah hung up the phone with a serene smile. They hadn't understood. Some truths are worth more than any threat. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was one of expectation. Sarah entered the courtroom carrying a red folder. Her decision was already made. It was time to show that justice, when true, does not bow to threats nor sell itself at any price. The courtroom was packed on that historic morning. Sarah ascended to the bench with the red folder in hand, aware that her every word would be minutely analyzed. Before beginning, her eyes met Michael's. There was a mixture of apprehension and trust in them. "Before we proceed with the testimonies," Sarah began, her firm voice echoing through the room, "I need to make an official statement." The silence that followed was almost palpable. "In the name of the transparency I have always advocated, I must declare that I have known the defendant, Michael Anderson, since our law school days." A murmur swept through the room. Prosecutor Reed rose immediately, but Sarah raised her hand, signaling she wasn't finished. "This late declaration is not due to any attempt at concealment, but to the certainty of my impartiality and the discovery of facts that transcend our old friendship." With precise gestures, Sarah began to expose the evidence she had gathered. She projected documents that showed an elaborate scheme of bid rigging, much larger than the accusations against Michael suggested. The defendant was not the architect of a corruption scheme. He was the obstacle that needed to be removed. In the gallery, James Blackwell abruptly stood up and left the room. 2 journalists followed him, their cameras recording every movement. Sarah continued her exposition, revealing the connections between shell companies and high-ranking government officials. "The evidence presented against the defendant was meticulously fabricated," she declared, showing inconsistencies in dates and documents. Meanwhile, evidence of a much larger scheme was systematically ignored or suppressed. During her speech, Sarah noticed strange movements at the back of the room. Men in suits were entering and leaving, making hurried phone calls. Prosecutor Reed's face alternated between shades of red and white as he frantically leafed through his documents. "This court," Sarah continued, "will not be an instrument of persecution, nor will it collude with the destruction of someone who dared to confront a corrupt system." Her voice gained strength. "Therefore, I order the immediate suspension of this trial and the submission of all evidence gathered here to the Supreme Court." Chaos ensued in the room. Lawyers gestured. Journalists rushed to use their phones. Photographers vied for the best angles. Amidst the confusion, Sarah noticed the discreet smile of her father, seated in the last row. During the forced recess that followed, her chambers transformed into a center of turbulence. Phone calls from authorities, visits from representatives of the Judicial Conduct Commission, reporters camped in the corridor. Sarah remained steadfast, receiving only her closest team. "Do you realize what you've just done?" asked Jessica, her clerk, with a mixture of admiration and concern. Sarah smiled, adjusting her glasses. "For the first time in a long time, Jessica, I'm absolutely certain of my actions." In the afternoon, the first results of her decision began to appear. 3 directors of companies involved in the scheme asked to give voluntary testimonies. A former cabinet member suddenly announced his resignation, citing personal reasons. David Miller's newspaper was preparing a special edition. In her apartment that night, Sarah received unexpected visits. Fellow judges, some she barely knew, came to express discreet support. "You've opened a door that can no longer be closed," said a retired appellate judge, shaking her hand. Rachel arrived late at night, bringing more documents. "The newsrooms are buzzing," she reported. "Journalists from all over the country are digging up similar stories in other states. It's as if you've removed the first stone from a dam." Before going to bed, Sarah received one last call. It was Michael. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for me, but for all who believe that justice is still possible." Sarah hung up the phone with tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of determination. The next morning, the newspapers carried her photo on the front page. The headlines varied, but all pointed in the same direction. A judge had dared to challenge the system, and now there was no turning back. The days following Sarah's decision were a mixture of chaos and revelations. The Supreme Court convened an extraordinary session to analyze the evidence she had sent. Meanwhile, the media went into a frenzy, with new allegations emerging every hour. Sarah observed the commotion from her chambers, now transformed into a kind of bunker. Her decision had triggered a chain reaction that went far beyond Michael's case. "Your Honor, the Judicial Conduct Commission is requesting an urgent hearing," Jessica informed, handing her another official letter. In the corridor, Sarah crossed paths with David Miller. The journalist looked exhausted, but his eyes shone with the excitement of someone at the center of a big story. "Your Honor, I need to thank you," he said, lowering his voice. "Your courage has opened the doors for many of us to do our job without fear." At night in her apartment, Sarah received an unexpected visit. Emma Anderson arrived accompanied by her children. "They wanted to thank you personally," Emma explained with tears in her eyes. Michael's oldest son, a 15-year-old teenager, hugged Sarah tightly. "Thank you for believing in my dad," he whispered. The next morning, the city dawned different. Groups of protesters gathered in front of the courthouse, some in support of Sarah, others demanding broader investigations. Banners and posters colored the streets of downtown, transforming the case into a symbol of the fight against corruption. At the Supreme Court, the atmosphere was tense. Justices met behind closed doors, analyzing the evidence presented by Sarah. The case had become too big to be ignored or hushed up. The international press began to report on what they called the case that shook America. Meanwhile, Sarah faced her own battles. The Judicial Conduct Commission initiated a process to evaluate her conduct, alleging possible breach of impartiality. She knew it was just the beginning of a long journey of defending her actions. "You've opened Pandora's box," her father commented during a family dinner. "But maybe that's exactly what this country needed." Sarah smiled, remembering the words he always repeated when she was a child. "True justice isn't always comfortable, but it's always necessary." At the newspaper office, Rachel worked tirelessly. Her investigation, now part of a national journalistic task force, began to reveal connections between Michael's case and similar schemes in other states. "It's as if we've pulled a thread and the whole fabric is starting to unravel," she explained to Sarah over the phone. Weeks passed and the case continued to dominate the headlines. Politicians resigned, businessmen were indicted, and a wave of anti-corruption reforms began to gain strength in Congress. Sarah observed it all with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension, aware that each new revelation was a confirmation of her decision. On a rainy afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected call. It was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. "Judge Thompson," he said, his grave voice conveying the weight of the situation, "I'd like to invite you for a private audience. We have much to discuss about the future of the American judiciary." That night, as she prepared for what could be the most important meeting of her career, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the young idealist who debated legal ethics with Michael in the law school corridors to the judge who dared to challenge an entire system. Looking out the window, she saw that the rain was beginning to cease, giving way to a slowly clearing sky. It was as if nature reflected the moment the country was going through. After the storm came the promise of brighter days. Sarah took a deep breath, adjusted her robe and prepared to face what would come next. The battle for justice was far from over, but now, for the first time in a long time, there was real hope for change.